They told everyone it was just a weekend hike, a simple escape from the noise of the city. 3 friends, 1 trail, and 2 nights in the wilderness. Ethan Miller was the one who planned it. He worked in IT, spent most of his days staring at monitors, and believed nature was the only thing that could reset a tired mind. Hiking had become his therapy. He tracked trails, collected maps, and followed forums where experienced hikers shared routes that most tourists never touched. Caleb Ross joined without hesitation. He was the adventurous type, always chasing something new, something that made him feel alive. Heights didn't scare him. Isolation didn't either. He trusted Ethan's planning more than his own instincts. Then there was Mark Holloway. Mark wasn't a hiker. He came because his marriage was quietly collapsing and silence at home felt heavier than the unknown of the woods. He didn't admit that to anyone. He just said he needed air. They chose a trail in the Pacific Northwest, far from crowded parks and family campsites. The name of the trail barely appeared online, mentioned only in scattered posts from people who sounded experienced, cautious, and strangely vague. The photos showed dense forests, narrow paths, and fog hanging low between trees even during daylight. Ethan liked that. No crowds, no noise, no cell service. They left Seattle early Friday morning, the city fading behind them as the road narrowed and the trees thickened. By the time they parked the car near the trailhead, the sky was already dimmer than expected, clouds pressing low like a lid. There was no welcome sign, just an old wooden post with faded paint and a trail marker that leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing. Mark joked about it being creepy. Caleb laughed and told him horror movies had ruined his brain. Ethan said nothing. He was too focused on checking his GPS. The device worked at first. A weak signal, but enough to confirm the route. 12 miles in, camp overnight, then another 8 miles looping back the next day. Simple. Within the first hour, the forest swallowed them. The air felt heavier than it should have. Not humid, just dense, like breathing through fabric. The trees were taller than any Mark remembered seeing, their tops disappearing into mist. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time, and the forest floor was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their boots and their breathing. They noticed it without saying anything at first. Silence is easier to ignore when you don't point at it. After another mile, Caleb finally spoke. He said it felt like the woods were waiting. He laughed when he said it, but no one laughed back. Ethan checked his GPS again. The signal flickered, then vanished. He frowned, tapped the screen, and said it would come back. It didn't. They kept moving. That was the plan. Trails don't disappear. Forests don't shift. Technology fails, but paths stay where they are. At least that's what Ethan believed. By late afternoon, the light had dimmed more than expected. The canopy above was thick, blocking most of the sky. Mark glanced at his watch and swore. It felt like evening already. They found a clearing that didn't appear on the map. A wide, open space where the trees stood farther apart, their trunks dark and scarred as if something had scraped against them repeatedly over the years. The ground was soft, almost sponge-like, and their boots sank slightly with every step. Ethan hesitated. This wasn't where they were supposed to camp, but the trail behind them seemed less defined than it had earlier, and pushing forward with failing light didn't feel smart, so they agreed to stop. Setting up camp should have been routine. They'd done it before on other trips, but nothing felt routine here. The forest seemed to absorb sound. When Mark dropped a metal tent pole, it didn't clatter. It landed with a dull, muted thud, as if the ground had swallowed the noise. Caleb tried to joke again. His voice sounded wrong in the open space, too loud and too small at the same time. They ate quietly, no appetite. The food tasted bland, like cardboard. Even the energy bars felt dry and flavorless. As night settled, the forest changed. The silence broke, but not in a comforting way. There were sounds now, distant and irregular. Something between movement and breathing. Not close enough to identify, not far enough to ignore. Mark asked if there were bears in the area. Ethan said yes, but they avoid camps. Caleb said whatever it was, it didn't sound like an animal. That was when they heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not circling, not approaching directly, just moving somewhere beyond the line of trees. Ethan reached for his flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through mist and bark, revealing nothing. The footsteps stopped the moment the light appeared. They waited. Seconds stretched, then minutes. Nothing. They told themselves it was paranoia. The mind fills silence with fear when it's tired. That explanation worked until the footsteps started again, closer this time. Mark's hands shook as he zipped his tent shut. Caleb whispered that it felt like whatever it was knew exactly where they were. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness beyond the fire, eyes fixed on something he couldn't quite see. The footsteps never reached them. They faded slowly, as if the thing making them had lost interest. Sleep didn't come easily. Mark woke sometime in the night with the sensation of being watched. The fire had burned low, embers barely glowing. The forest beyond the clearing looked thicker than before, trees pressing inward as if the space itself was shrinking. He held his breath and listened. That was when he realized the forest was silent again. No wind, no insects, no movement. Then he heard breathing that wasn't his own. It came from just outside the tent, slow, steady, unnaturally calm. Mark wanted to scream. He wanted to move. He did neither. His body refused to respond, frozen by a primal fear that told him movement meant death. The breathing stopped. Something brushed against the side of the tent, not clawing. Not striking, just a gentle, curious touch, like fingers testing fabric. Mark shut his eyes and waited for it to tear through. It didn't. Morning arrived without warning. Sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, and the forest looked almost normal again. Birds chirped somewhere far off. Insects buzzed. The clearing seemed less oppressive. Mark didn't mention what happened. Neither did Ethan or Caleb. They all packed up in silence, pretending the night hadn't changed anything. They were supposed to continue deeper before looping back, but when Ethan tried to find the trail, it wasn't there. The path that had led them into the clearing was gone. In its place was a dense wall of undergrowth, thick and tangled, as if no one had ever walked there at all. Caleb suggested they must have set camp slightly off the trail. Ethan walked in widening circles, searching for familiar markers. Scratches on trees, bent branches, anything. Nothing matched his memory. The forest felt different now, tighter, closer, as if it had shifted while they slept. Mark said they should turn back immediately. Ethan finally admitted what he'd been avoiding. His GPS still didn't work. His compass spun slowly, never settling on a direction. That was when they realized something was deeply wrong. They weren't just off the trail. They were lost, and the forest knew it. Far off beyond the trees, something moved. Not footsteps this time, something heavier, something that didn't bother hiding anymore. And as the sound echoed through the woods, all three men understood the same terrifying truth at once. Whatever had watched them the night before hadn't left. It had been waiting, and now it was following. They decided to move east. It wasn't a logical decision. Nothing about their situation was logical anymore, but east was the only direction that felt less wrong than the others. The forest in that direction seemed thinner, the trees spaced just enough to suggest movement might be possible. Ethan led the way, forcing confidence into his steps. Leaders weren't supposed to hesitate, even when they were terrified. Caleb followed close behind, scanning the woods constantly, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. Mark stayed in the middle, afraid of falling behind, but equally afraid of seeing what might be waiting ahead. The ground changed as they walked. It dipped and rose unpredictably, roots twisting up like veins beneath the soil. More than once, Mark stumbled, catching himself just before falling. Each time, his heart pounded harder, convinced that noise alone might draw attention. They didn't speak. Talking felt dangerous, like announcing their presence to something that already knew too much. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than 30 minutes, the forest began to thin. Light filtered through more easily, and the air felt marginally lighter. Relief crept in cautiously, fragile and uncertain. Then they saw the structure. At first, Ethan thought it was a fallen tree, then the angles didn't make sense. The shape was too deliberate, too straight. As they moved closer, it became clear that it was a cabin. Old, weathered, nearly swallowed by the forest. The roof sagged in the middle, moss growing thick along its edges. The wood was darkened by decades of rain and rot. No windows were intact. The door hung open, one hinge barely holding. Caleb exhaled slowly. A shelter meant people. People meant maps, supplies, maybe even a radio. Mark didn't share the optimism. The cabin felt wrong. Not abandoned in the normal way things were abandoned, but left behind deliberately, like something people fled from and never returned to. Ethan hesitated only briefly before stepping toward it. They needed answers, and answers were never found by standing still. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. The floorboards creaked under their weight, but not loudly. Everything here felt muted, subdued, as if sound itself struggled to exist. There was furniture, barely recognizable. A table collapsed on one side, a chair with 3 legs, a rusted stove in the corner. No signs of recent use. No footprints, no trash, no evidence of life in years. On the far wall, carved deep into the wood, were symbols. They weren't letters, not words, just shapes. Jagged lines and circles intersecting at odd angles. They looked old, weathered by time, but still sharp enough to catch the eye. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He had no reason to fear symbols, and yet something about them made his skin crawl. Caleb traced one with his finger, then recoiled as if burned. He said it felt warm. Ethan told him not to touch anything else. They searched the cabin quickly. No maps, no food, no radio. Just emptiness and the quiet reminder that someone had once lived here and left without taking anything with them. As they stepped back outside, the forest felt different again, closer. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches overlapping like clasped fingers. The path they'd taken to reach the cabin was gone, replaced by dense growth that hadn't been there moments ago. Mark's voice broke when he asked how that was possible. No one answered. That was when they heard it again. Movement, not subtle this time, not distant. Something large moved through the woods, snapping branches effortlessly. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't cautious. It moved with the confidence of something that knew the land belonged to it. Caleb whispered that it sounded like it was circling. Ethan felt panic claw at his chest. Circling meant hunting. They ran. There was no direction, no plan. Just instinct. The forest tore at them as they pushed through undergrowth, branches scratching faces and arms. Mark felt warm blood trickle down his cheek but didn't slow. Behind them, the sound followed, not chasing, keeping pace. As if it knew they couldn't escape. They burst into another clearing, smaller than the first, the ground bare and dark. In the center stood a single tree, dead and split down the middle, its trunk hollowed out like something had carved it from the inside. They stopped, gasping for breath. The sound stopped too. For a moment, there was nothing but their breathing and the pounding of blood in their ears. Then the smell hit them. Rot, old decay layered over something sharper, metallic. Mark gagged, covering his mouth. Caleb took a step backward and froze. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind trees, were shapes, not animals, not quite human either. They stood upright, motionless, their outlines distorted by shadow and mist. Long limbs, shoulders too narrow, heads tilted at unnatural angles. Ethan's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. The shapes didn't move. They didn't need to. Being seen felt like permission enough. One of them stepped forward. It moved wrong. Its joints bent too far, its stride uneven, as if it were learning how to walk by watching humans from a distance. Its face was obscured, either by shadow or something else Ethan couldn't bring himself to identify. Mark whispered that it was smiling. No one checked. They backed away slowly, instinct screaming not to turn their backs. The shapes remained still, watching, waiting. Then the ground beneath them shifted. Mark fell. The earth gave way beneath his feet, collapsing into a shallow pit concealed by leaves and rot. He cried out as he hit the bottom hard, pain shooting through his leg. The sound broke whatever fragile restraint existed. The shapes moved, fast, too fast. Caleb grabbed Mark under the arms, pulling with everything he had. Ethan joined him, panic lending strength. Together, they hauled Mark free just as something slammed into the ground where he'd fallen. The impact shook the clearing. They ran again. This time, the forest screamed back. Branches snapped violently. Leaves whipped through the air. The ground trembled with heavy movement behind them. Whatever had been watching no longer cared about hiding. Mark limped, barely able to keep up. Pain shot through his ankle with every step. He knew he was slowing them down. He said it out loud, breathless, desperate, told them to leave him. Ethan refused without hesitation. Caleb didn't argue either, but fear darkened his expression. He knew what slowing down meant. They reached a steep incline, the ground sloping sharply downward. Ethan skidded as he tried to slow, grabbing at roots to keep from tumbling. Mark slipped, crying out as he fell hard, rolling several feet before crashing into a tree. Something howled behind them. The sound wasn't rage, it was satisfaction. Caleb turned back, eyes wide. He saw movement through the trees, multiple shapes now, closing in. "We can't," he said, voice breaking. "We can't keep doing this." Ethan grabbed him, shaking his head violently. "We don't leave anyone." Caleb looked past him, fear hardening into something colder. "Then we all die." Before Ethan could respond, Caleb ran. Not forward, back the way they'd come, straight toward the forest and the approaching shapes. Mark screamed his name. Ethan froze, shock locking his body in place. Caleb didn't make it far. Something emerged from the trees and grabbed him with terrifying speed. There was a brief, horrible sound as Caleb was lifted off the ground, limbs flailing. Then he was dragged backward into the woods. His scream cut off abruptly, as if someone had reached inside his chest and shut him down from within. Silence followed. Ethan stood shaking, unable to move, unable to breathe. Mark pulled himself upright, leaning heavily against the tree. Tears streaked his face, mixing with dirt and blood. They didn't see what took Caleb. They didn't need to. The forest had claimed him. The sounds didn't follow immediately. No pursuit, no movement, just waiting. Ethan knew then that whatever lived here didn't need to rush. Fear worked better when it was allowed to settle. They moved again, slower now. Exhaustion weighed heavy, grief and guilt crushing Ethan's chest. Every step felt like betrayal. As night began to fall again, the forest darkened unnaturally fast. Shadows stretched and twisted, swallowing what little light remained. Mark collapsed near another cluster of trees, his injured leg giving out completely. He couldn't stand, could barely breathe through the pain. Ethan knelt beside him, heart racing. He didn't know what to do anymore. He had no tools, no signal, no path, just darkness closing in. Mark looked at him with a strange calm. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I think this place, it doesn't let everyone go." Ethan shook his head violently, tears spilling freely now. Mark smiled faintly. "You have to keep moving." Before Ethan could stop him, Mark pushed him away and shouted into the forest. A raw, desperate sound. Movement erupted instantly. Branches snapped. Footsteps thundered. Ethan ran. He didn't look back. He didn't stop running until his lungs burned and his legs nearly gave out. The sounds followed for a while, then gradually faded, drawn away by Mark's sacrifice. When Ethan finally collapsed, the forest was silent again. Morning found him alone. No Mark, no Caleb. No sign they'd ever existed. And when Ethan stumbled onto a familiar trail hours later, collapsing onto gravel and dirt that led back to the real world, rescue teams would later say something unsettling. They said that section of forest had no record of cabins, no unexplored clearings, no missing hikers in recent years, and no explanation for why Ethan's GPS, when recovered, showed weeks of movement recorded in a place that didn't exist. Or why, deep in the forest, something had learned how to hunt by watching men run. The forest seemed endless as Ethan pressed forward, exhaustion weighing on every step. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he knew stopping meant certain death. Every snapped branch, every rustle of leaves reminded him that he was still being watched. He couldn't see Caleb or Mark. The memory of Caleb being dragged into the woods haunted him, and the image of Mark pushing him away to save them both kept replaying. Sunlight broke intermittently through the thick canopy, but the light was weak, diffused, almost sickly. Shadows twisted unnaturally, making the forest seem alive, bending toward him with every step. Ethan's compass still spun, useless, as if the forest had rewritten its geography overnight. Paths he remembered were gone, replaced by walls of undergrowth and trees that seemed to have grown closer together. He stumbled upon another clearing, this one smaller than before. At its center stood a large, fallen log, hollowed and dark, almost like a trap waiting for the unsuspecting. Ethan skirted it cautiously, feeling the subtle vibration in the ground beneath his feet, the thrum of something massive moving unseen. He told himself it was paranoia. Logic had abandoned him hours ago, and survival instinct had become all-consuming. A soft sound broke the oppressive silence, a whisper, almost imperceptible, drifting through the air. Ethan froze, straining to hear. The whisper became clearer, low, guttural, yet eerily human. "Leave," it seemed to say, or maybe it was a name. "Ethan," he shook his head violently, trying to reject the thought, but the voice lingered. It wasn't coming from anywhere he could locate. It was all around him. Fear sharpened his senses. Every branch, every shadow, every hint of movement became a potential threat. He remembered what Mark had said, "This place doesn't let everyone go." Ethan now understood exactly what that meant. The forest didn't just trap people physically, it ensnared their minds, twisting reality into something unrecognizable, making them doubt their own senses. He forced himself to keep moving. Every step felt heavier than the last, each breath a battle. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The sun sank lower, filtering through a thickening fog, turning the air cold and damp. He stumbled over roots, scraped his arms on brambles, and yet he pressed on, driven by the thought that somewhere, beyond this nightmare, there might be safety. Then he saw movement ahead, figures emerging from the mist. They were humanoid, elongated, with twisted limbs and pale, reflective skin that glimmered in the muted light. Ethan froze, fear and fascination gripping him. The creatures didn't move erratically. They glided, silent, deliberate. Their eyes, black and deep, seemed to pierce his very soul. Ethan tried to hide behind a cluster of trees, holding his breath. They didn't notice him, or maybe they did, but they didn't care. He watched as one approached the hollow log he had skirted earlier, inspecting it, tilting its head curiously, then moving on. There were no sounds, no warnings, only observation. And then they disappeared back into the fog as silently as they had appeared. The encounter left him trembling, more aware than ever of the forest's sentience. It wasn't a place where accidents happened. It was alive, and it knew him. Every step he took was anticipated, every move calculated against him. Ethan realized that running blindly could be as dangerous as standing still. He had to think, to strategize, even with his fear threatening to consume him. He found a small stream cutting through the undergrowth and decided to follow it, hoping water might lead him to a natural exit. The cold water on his hands and face brought momentary clarity, grounding him in reality. He drank cautiously, knowing he needed energy, and pressed on, letting the sound of flowing water guide him. The stream was narrow, but it offered a consistent direction, a thread through the otherwise chaotic forest. Night began to fall again, bringing a chill that seeped into his bones. The fog thickened, wrapping the forest in a ghostly shroud. Ethan set a small, temporary camp near the stream, keeping his fire minimal, just enough to see his immediate surroundings. He couldn't rest completely. Every crackle in the distance made him jolt awake, expecting the creatures, or something else entirely, to appear. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. In his dreams, the forest shifted, growing taller, twisting, reaching toward him. He dreamt of Caleb and Mark, calling his name, their faces twisted in fear and pain. He awoke each time with a start, the fog pressing in, the same quiet sound of movement just beyond the firelight. Always observing, always waiting. Morning arrived, pale and gray, sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. Ethan followed the stream again, moving cautiously but with determination. Hours passed, and he saw signs of the outside world, fallen leaves scattered differently, a faint trail of animal prints that seemed normal, but he couldn't bring himself to trust them fully. Each step forward was tempered with suspicion. Then he saw a break in the trees. Light, real sunlight, pierced through in a way that promised escape. He ran toward it, hope surging. As he emerged from the forest, the landscape transformed into rolling hills, open grassland. The air smelled different, clean and untainted. He collapsed, exhausted but alive, and for the first time felt a semblance of safety. Authorities later found Ethan disoriented on a trail known to locals, miles from where he had started. He tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed him. Search parties found no trace of Caleb or Mark. No cabin, no clearings, no footprints. The GPS recovered from his pack told an impossible story. Hours spent moving through places that didn't exist on any map. Ethan never returned to hiking again. He avoided forests, avoided trails, avoided silence. Yet in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled outside his window or shadows stretched unnaturally long, he remembered. He remembered the eyes watching, the forest alive, the shapes moving with impossible grace. And he knew, deep down, that some part of that place had followed him back into the world of the living, waiting patiently for the next moment it could reclaim what belonged to it. The wind had begun to pick up as Julia and her friends approached the edge of the Appalachian Trail. Autumn had painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty of the forest could not mask the chill that settled deep in her bones. She tightened her scarf, pulling her jacket closer, as if that simple motion could ward off the unease she felt. Alex, her older brother, walked a few steps ahead, carrying their backpacks and checking the map. "We're right on schedule," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He had always been practical, but even he seemed unsettled today. His eyes darted to the tree line more than necessary, scanning for any sign of movement. Julia noticed the tension, but chose to ignore it, convincing herself that the forest was simply vast and full of life. Their friend Nate trailed behind, constantly muttering about how quiet it was. He had grown up in the city and was not used to the dense isolation of the backwoods. "It's too silent," he said, stopping mid-step. "I don't like it. Something feels wrong." Julia tried to laugh, but her attempt sounded hollow. She forced herself to keep moving. The trail started as a well-trodden path, easy underfoot, the soft crunch of leaves accompanying every step. Hours in, it narrowed considerably. The trees leaned over them, branches interlocking like clasped hands, blocking much of the light. The air grew cooler, and a fine mist settled around them. By late afternoon, visibility had decreased to barely 10 feet in any direction. Julia noticed it first, the silence. Not the normal quiet that comes with forested trails, but a deliberate, unnatural quiet. No birds chirping, no wind through the branches, no sound of running water, only their footsteps. And those seemed oddly muffled, as if the forest itself had swallowed the noise. She mentioned it to Alex, who responded with a shrug, saying, "It's just the fog, makes everything sound muted." But Julia wasn't convinced. There was something different about this part of the trail. Hours passed, the trail twisting and turning, leading them to a part of the forest Julia did not recognize from the map. Alex checked again, frowning. "This shouldn't be here," he muttered. He rotated the map, comparing landmarks, but nothing aligned. The trail they were following didn't exist on any map he had ever seen. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the creeping fear in his chest. Nate lagged behind, complaining about the growing darkness. "We should have set up camp hours ago," he said. His voice wavered, betraying the anxiety Julia tried to hide. The three of them had agreed to finish a 10-mile loop before nightfall, but the hours had slipped past unnoticed. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the sun dipping lower than it should have. Julia felt a strange sensation crawling along her spine. She kept telling herself it was imagination, that her mind was playing tricks in the fog. But then she saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees ahead. She froze. Alex noticed her hesitation and turned sharply. "What is it?" he whispered. Julia shook her head, unable to speak. The shadow disappeared before Alex could glimpse it, leaving only a subtle swaying of the branches. They continued, but a tension had settled over them, thick and heavy. Every step was cautious, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of fear through their bodies. The trail began to slope downward, the forest floor slick with damp leaves. The mist thickened, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Nate kept muttering, his voice barely audible, questioning whether they should turn back. Alex refused to entertain the idea. "We just keep moving," he said firmly. "We'll find a campsite soon." As twilight approached, they stumbled into a clearing. It was small, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dense trees. In the center stood an abandoned cabin, nearly camouflaged by nature. The wood was blackened with age, windows broken, the door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Julia's heart sank. Something about the cabin felt wrong, off, like it had been waiting for them. She glanced at Alex and Nate, but neither seemed to notice the unease settling in her chest. They decided to explore, hoping to find a safe place to camp. The cabin's interior smelled of decay, dust, and mold. Broken furniture littered the floor. A table sat tilted on one side, a chair broken in half. Rusted tools lay scattered across the floor. Nothing indicated recent human activity, and yet Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. As they explored further, Julia noticed scratches on the walls, not fresh but deep enough to leave impressions. Strange symbols had been etched into the wood, looping and jagged, almost like a language she didn't recognize. The marks were unsettling, and she felt an inexplicable pull, as though the symbols themselves were watching her. She backed away instinctively, her pulse quickening. Nate found a small trapdoor under a tattered rug. He bent down, pushing it open. A narrow stairway descended into darkness. "Probably a cellar," he said, trying to sound casual. Alex shone his flashlight down the steps, revealing nothing but shadow. Julia's stomach turned. She wanted to leave, wanted to run back to the trail, but some force kept her feet rooted. They had to see. They had to know what lay below. The air grew colder as they descended. The faint smell of decay intensified. Every creak of the wooden stairs echoed loudly, as if amplifying their presence. At the bottom, the space widened. A single stone floor stretched before them, and in the center was a pile of objects, old and decayed. Clothing, photographs, a rusted lantern. But something else caught Julia's eye, a faint outline of footprints in the dust. Not human. Slender, elongated, irregular. They seemed to move toward a wall where more symbols had been carved. Fear clawed at Julia's throat, making it difficult to breathe. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. Nate muttered something incomprehensible, stepping closer to the footprints, and the air seemed to shift. The basement temperature dropped drastically. Their breath was visible in the pale light of the flashlight. A sudden noise, metal scraping against stone, made them all jump. Julia pointed the beam toward the sound. Nothing, only shadows moving strangely. The flashlight flickered, plunging them into near darkness. Panic set in. They were trapped below, the stairs behind them unstable. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet they felt compelled to move deeper, toward an answer they didn't want. Then she heard it, a soft whispering, so close it seemed to be in her mind. "Leave or join us," the words were clear, unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She looked at Alex and Nate. Their faces were pale, frozen with fear. The symbols on the wall seemed to writhe in the dim light, moving ever so slightly, as if alive. Julia wanted to run, but before she could move, the shadows coalesced. Figures, thin and elongated, emerged from the darkness at the edges of the room. Their eyes glimmered faintly, reflecting the flashlight beam. They didn't move quickly, yet there was a predatory precision in every motion. They were studying the intruders. Alex whispered, "We need to leave, now." But the basement door was jammed. They were trapped. Julia's mind raced, searching for options. Panic surged, her body trembling. The shadows closed in slowly, methodically, almost enjoying the fear they had induced. Every step forward felt like moving through molasses. Julia realized the forest, the cabin, the shadows, they were all connected. The place had a consciousness, and it had marked them the moment they entered. Survival meant understanding something they couldn't possibly comprehend. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief darkness, the whispers grew louder. Julia screamed, the sound bouncing off the walls and mingling with the unearthly murmurs. Alex and Nate grabbed her hands, pulling her toward the stairs. The shadows hesitated, then moved with unnatural speed to block their exit. Julia felt a cold presence brush past her, not touching, but exerting a force that made her stumble. Something had chosen this moment to assert control. The basement seemed to pulse, alive, as if the house itself was breathing. Her heart hammered in her chest. Every rational thought dissolved. Fear became pure instinct. They ran toward the wall opposite the basement entrance. Julia noticed an old, crumbling section of the stone wall, loose enough to break through. They dug frantically, hands raw and bleeding, as the shadows advanced. Finally, a small gap opened. One by one, they squeezed through, emerging into a narrow passage outside, overgrown with vines and debris. The cool night air hit them, grounding them, but the sense of danger did not fade. The whispers followed, carried on the wind, fading gradually but never gone entirely. Exhausted, shaking, and terrified, they stumbled into the forest proper. The trail seemed distorted, unfamiliar, but they pressed forward, guided by some distant, instinctive memory of safety. Julia realized that what they had experienced wasn't just a cabin or shadows. It was a fragment of a living nightmare, a place that existed on the edge of reality, marking trespassers for reasons beyond understanding. The night stretched endlessly around them, and even as they walked, the forest watched. Fog clung to the forest floor as Julia, Alex, and Nate stumbled through the narrow path that seemed to twist endlessly. The chill in the air had grown sharper, cutting through layers of clothing, biting at their exposed skin. Every step brought uncertainty. The ground was uneven, covered in decayed leaves that hid jagged roots and rocks, threatening to trip them. Julia felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears as if the forest itself had synchronized to her fear. Alex led the way, holding a flashlight that barely penetrated the thickening mist. His face was pale, eyes constantly scanning for any signs of movement. "Stay close," he whispered. His voice was steady but tense, betraying the undercurrent of panic that he refused to show. Nate shivered beside him, mumbling about shadows moving at the edges of his vision. Julia had begun to notice them, two forms that appeared and disappeared in the corner of her eye, shapes that weren't there when she looked directly. The trail seemed endless. What was supposed to be a short hike had stretched into an ordeal. They passed trees twisted in unnatural ways, bark carved into symbols that seemed to shift when observed. Julia tried to focus on the ground beneath her feet, ignoring the whispers that floated faintly through the air. They were soft, unintelligible at first, almost like the wind, but then words began to emerge. "Leave me now," the voices hissed, carried through the fog, impossible to locate, surrounding them from all directions. Nate panicked, backing into a tree. "I don't want to be here," he shouted, voice cracking. Alex grabbed him firmly, trying to steer him forward. Julia's hands shook as she gripped her backpack straps, every nerve alert. They had no idea how far they had traveled. The trail seemed to have grown. elongating as if the forest itself were reshaping in real time, stretching the distance, disorienting them completely. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they stumbled upon a clearing. It was circular, surrounded by trees that leaned inward as if to observe. The center contained a small pond, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky and distorted tree silhouettes. Julia hesitated, sensing that the pond was more than it seemed. She could almost feel it watching, waiting for them to approach. The air was heavier here, each breath laborious, thick with an inexplicable dread. Alex scanned the perimeter with the flashlight, noting subtle disturbances in the foliage, broken branches, leaves shifted unnaturally, footprints that weren't entirely human. Nate stepped closer to the water's edge, staring into the reflection. Julia noticed the distorted images, their faces stretched and warped, eyes hollow and deep, expressions twisted in terror. She tried to pull Nate back, but he didn't respond immediately, mesmerized, trapped by the hypnotic reflection. A sudden ripple in the pond startled them all. Something moved beneath the water, slowly, methodically. The surface bulged as if a massive form was rising, yet nothing broke the water completely. The pond remained eerily still, ripples vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Julia felt an instinctive terror, a gut reaction that screamed they were no longer observers in the forest, but prey. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, urging them to leave, but the exit from the clearing was obscured by thick, unnatural undergrowth. They tried moving around the pond, staying close to the edges. The forest seemed to shift, branches reaching out like fingers, scraping at their clothing and faces. Every step was met with resistance, not physical but psychological, a weight pressing down on them, slowing their movements and muddling their perception of distance. It became impossible to tell whether they were moving forward or spinning in place. Nate began to panic entirely. I can't, he screamed, running in circles as if the forest itself was a maze designed to trap him. Julia grabbed his arm, trying to restrain him, but the pull of unseen forces seemed to tug at them both. Alex yelled for them to keep moving, but words felt futile against the oppressive presence surrounding them. The forest wasn't just a backdrop, it was alive, intelligent, and aware. Through the fog, Julia saw shadows moving differently than any tree or bush should. Figures, elongated and slender, flitted between the trunks, appearing closer than their distance warranted. Their movements were almost liquid, flowing silently, observing, calculating. Julia wanted to run, but her legs were numb. Her mind screamed in terror, yet a part of her was entranced by the unnatural rhythm of the shadows. She knew looking directly was dangerous, but turning away felt like surrendering to whatever force inhabited the clearing. Suddenly, one of the shadows stepped into the faint light of Alex's flashlight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs bent at angles that defied normal anatomy. Its head tilted unnaturally, facing them directly, though it had no recognizable face, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull-like form. Julia felt a wave of nausea as the creature's gaze seemed to penetrate her very thoughts, unmasking her deepest fears. She stumbled back, nearly falling, her mind screaming at her to escape, yet her body felt paralyzed. Alex moved instinctively, shining the light more directly, and the shadow recoiled slightly, then disappeared into the fog as if it had never been there. Julia barely breathed, her ears ringing. Nate whispered incoherently, repeating phrases she couldn't understand, but she knew he was scared beyond reason. The forest was testing them, wearing them down, preying on their terror. Every instinct screamed they had to keep moving, yet the path out remained elusive. Hours passed. The clearing seemed endless, its borders shifting imperceptibly, keeping them inside. The pond remained, dark and reflective, ripples occasionally breaking the surface in sync with the shadows' movements. Julia realized that no matter which direction they took, the forest seemed to anticipate their steps. Every attempt to flee led them back to the clearing, as if the forest itself were a predator, corralling them, bending reality to its will. Desperation set in. Julia whispered to Alex that they needed to stop, think, observe. Panic had clouded judgment. He nodded, realizing she was right. They crouched near a cluster of thick roots, watching the pond and the surrounding trees. The fog swirled unnaturally, distorting shapes, making it impossible to discern reality from illusion. Whispers continued, insidious, urging, tempting, reminding them they were intruders, prey marked for capture. A sudden motion drew their attention. Near the pond's edge, a branch snapped sharply. Something emerged smaller than the previous shadows, but quick, darting, intelligent. It paused, sniffing the air, considering. Julia's heart raced as she realized they were studying them, learning, cataloging, aware of every movement, every hesitation. The forest was alive, but these creatures were the mind of it, the mechanism enforcing its will. They remained frozen, knowing movement could provoke a response they might not survive. Time stretched, minutes became hours. The air chilled further, frost beginning to form along fallen leaves and exposed roots. Each breath was visible, fogging and condensing rapidly, as if the clearing itself was compressing. Julia clutched her backpack, searching desperately for any tool, any weapon, but her hands found nothing. Fear was their only companion. Then, as abruptly as it began, the fog began to dissipate slightly, revealing a narrow path leading away from the clearing. Julia exhaled, hope surging. Alex gestured toward it silently. Carefully they moved, staying low, avoiding drawing attention. Every step felt perilous, yet the forest allowed them passage, a cruel permission, almost as if amused. Shadows lingered at the edges, retreating but never fully gone, reminding them they were still within its domain. By the time they reached denser, more familiar woods, the whispers faded, replaced by the natural sounds of distant birds and rustling leaves. The clearing and the pond were gone, swallowed once again by the forest's ever-changing geography. They paused, breathing heavily, the reality of survival hitting them. They were alive but forever marked. The forest had tested them, and it knew they would never forget. Even as they emerged onto a real trail hours later, the memory of the clearing, the shadows, and the whispers haunted them. Julia understood fully. The forest didn't just trap bodies. It trapped minds, embedding fear deep, ensuring its presence lingered long after they escaped. And as they walked silently, each step deliberate, each glance over the shoulder wary, she knew that the forest would watch them, always waiting for the next time curiosity led them astray. The night pressed in around them as Julia, Alex, and Nate continued along the winding trail, their muscles aching, their minds frayed from the constant tension. The trees seemed taller, leaning over them, their branches entwined like fingers forming a cage. The moonlight struggled through the dense canopy, casting eerie patterns that danced and shifted with the swaying branches. Every step felt as though it were being watched, recorded, catalogued. The forest was not merely a backdrop. It was a predator, sentient and patient. They came upon another clearing, smaller than the last, almost like a breathing pocket of air in the suffocating woods. At its center, a stone altar stood, ancient and weathered, etched with symbols similar to the ones they had seen in the basement of the cabin. The markings glowed faintly in the moonlight, an unholy illumination that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their rapid heartbeats. Julia instinctively took a step back. This place was older, darker, more malevolent than anything they had encountered before. Alex shined the flashlight around the clearing. Shadows flickered unnaturally at the periphery, moving just beyond clear sight, disappearing when he tried to focus directly on them. Nate whimpered, unable to look away from a particular shadow that seemed to twist unnaturally near the tree line. Julia gritted her teeth and forced herself to concentrate, to think rationally. Yet rationality was slipping away, replaced by a profound, instinctive terror. From the darkness emerged a figure, humanoid but grotesquely elongated. its limbs bent in impossible angles, its movements liquid yet purposeful. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes, black, reflective, and infinite, locked onto Julia. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, a hum felt more than heard. Julia froze, unable to move, feeling the pull of the forest's consciousness pressing into her mind. The figure tilted its head, almost acknowledging her presence, and then disappeared into the mist. The forest was alive with whispers again, carried by the wind, inside their ears, inside their minds. The words were fragmented. Leave, join, we watch, you belong. Each phrase was a dagger, carving fear deeper into their psyches. The whispers were relentless, mingling with the pounding of their hearts. Julia realized that the forest had learned them, adapted to their fears, and was now weaponizing their own minds against them. Alex whispered for them to keep moving. They followed a narrow trail that curved sharply, each step more tentative than the last. Branches tore at their clothing, roots threatened to trip them, and every rustle suggested the presence of the figures that had haunted them for hours. They could no longer tell how far they had traveled. Distances seemed distorted. The forest manipulated their perception, making escape feel simultaneously near and impossibly distant. They stumbled upon a fallen tree bridging a ravine, its gnarled roots creating a precarious path. Julia stepped carefully, gripping the bark for support. Every movement seemed amplified, each sound echoing unnaturally. Halfway across, she froze. A shadow moved below, following her steps. The whispering grew louder, almost screaming in her mind. She glanced down and saw a figure, darker than the night itself, its eyes glowing faintly, mirroring their every movement. Her stomach churned and panic surged like a tidal wave. Alex reached her side, grabbing her arm. "Keep moving," he hissed. Nate, trembling, followed, stumbling slightly, nearly falling into the ravine. They made it across, hearts hammering, limbs shaking. But Julia knew this wasn't over. The forest had marked them, and it would not relent until they had either succumbed to terror or escaped its boundaries entirely. Hours passed in disoriented silence. The landscape shifted subtly, continuously, as if the forest itself were breathing and rearranging itself. Julia noticed patterns in the shadows, movement that defied normal physics, angles that should have been impossible. Every instinct screamed to run, but the trail led them deeper, toward an unknown destination that the forest had prepared. Finally, a faint light appeared ahead. Sunlight, or something resembling it, filtered through the canopy in thin beams, creating a fragile path. Relief surged, but Julia's mind refused to relax. She knew better than to trust appearances. The forest was deceptive, patient, and infinitely cruel, yet instinct drove them forward, every step heavy but necessary. They emerged onto an open ridge, the trees receding slightly. The moonlight revealed rolling hills, familiar topography that suggested escape. Their pace quickened, muscles straining as the adrenaline pushed them forward. Behind them, the whispers faded into the night, replaced by the ordinary sounds of nature, distant and almost comforting. Julia dared to hope that the ordeal was ending, that they had survived the forest's trial. Hours later, they found a ranger station. Exhausted, dirty, and shaken, they recounted their experience. The rangers listened politely, scribbling notes, but it was clear that they doubted the events. Maps showed no such trails, no cabin, no altar, and no previous reports of missing hikers in the immediate area. Julia realized the forest existed in a place partially outside documented reality, a hidden realm that preyed upon the unsuspecting. Even after they returned home, sleep eluded them. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch, every breeze carried whispers. Julia could feel the forest watching, sensing, patient. They had survived, but the forest had left an imprint, a mark of terror and vigilance that would linger forever. She knew, deep down, that someday, somehow, it would call again, and this time, they might not be able to escape its grasp. Julia's final thought before succumbing to exhaustion was chillingly simple. The forest doesn't forgive curiosity, and it never forgets. The sun was setting behind the hills as Mara drove the old dirt road deeper into the mountains. Her friends, Leo and Sam, sat quietly in the back seat, the car's engine humming softly against the growing silence of the forest. Autumn had turned the leaves to fiery shades of red and orange, but the beauty of the scenery did little to calm the tension among them. Each bend in the road revealed denser trees, shadows stretching long across the narrow path, and a creeping sense of isolation that settled like a weight in Mara's chest. Leo broke the silence. "We should set up camp before it gets too dark," he said, glancing at the rearview mirror. Sam nodded but didn't speak, eyes fixed on the trees rushing past, every shadow appearing alive. Mara clenched the steering wheel tighter. She had chosen this route for adventure, for thrill, but now she felt an unshakable unease, a sense that the forest itself was watching their progress, anticipating their arrival. They reached a small clearing beside a forgotten ranger station. The building was old, paint peeling, windows cracked. It looked abandoned for years, yet something about it radiated a cold familiarity, as if it had always expected them. They unloaded the car and set up their gear quickly, the urgency amplified by the thinning light. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the clearing, the air thick with a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. As they began to explore the area, Mara noticed something strange, tracks, not quite human, leading from the edge of the forest to the clearing. They were elongated, with odd impressions between toes and fingers, as though whoever, or whatever, made them was not constrained by normal anatomy. She pointed them out to Leo, who frowned and stepped closer. "These don't look recent," he said, crouching to inspect the impressions. Sam, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless, muttering that they should leave, but Mara insisted they explore just a little further, curiosity outweighing fear. The first night passed with uneasy sleep. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint sounds that seemed deliberate in a way that unsettled them. Branches cracked in the darkness, yet when they shone a flashlight toward the sound, nothing was there. Every rustle seemed to echo unnaturally, making the forest feel alive, attentive, aware. Mara could feel it pressing against her mind, testing, learning, watching. On the second morning, they found a narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. Mara suggested following it, hoping it might lead to a river or a familiar landmark. The trail twisted and curved, growing narrower with every step. The trees leaned closer together, their trunks like sentinels, forming corridors that seemed intentionally designed to disorient. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting pale, distorted shadows on the forest floor. Every step became more difficult, roots and rocks hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. As they walked, Sam noticed a strange formation ahead, a cluster of trees intertwined into a ring, unnatural in symmetry, as if shaped deliberately. Leo approached cautiously. The bark of the trees bore markings, similar to ancient symbols Mara had seen in books about folklore. The carvings pulsed faintly, catching the dim light of their flashlights. Mara felt her stomach churn. The forest was sending a message, one they could barely comprehend, a warning embedded in nature itself. They pressed forward despite the unease. Hours passed, the trail elongating in impossible ways, each turn leading them deeper into the unknown. Shadows moved at the edges of vision, never quite forming, yet always suggesting presence. The whispering started again, soft and unintelligible, almost like a language from beyond understanding. It circled around them, sometimes directly in their ears, other times seeming to emanate from the forest itself. Mara shivered, realizing their intrusion had not gone unnoticed. By evening, they stumbled upon another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, hollowed-out tree. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, interior dark and seemingly bottomless. A strange warmth radiated from within, an impossible contrast to the cold surrounding them. Leo approached first, shining a light inside. Shadows shifted as though the tree were alive, breathing, observing. Mara felt the weight of eyes upon her, though she could see no creatures. Sam backed away, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken in years. Suddenly, movement. Figures, thin and elongated, emerged from the periphery of the clearing. Their limbs bent unnaturally, faces obscured by shadow, eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling the trio as if assessing, cataloging. The forest itself seemed to pulse with their presence, branches bending subtly toward the figures, air thickening as the temperature dropped sharply. Mara's heart raced uncontrollably. Fear had replaced curiosity entirely. The figures did not speak, yet Mara felt communication directly in her mind, images, sensations, warnings. The forest had a consciousness, and these entities were its agents. They understood intention, fear, desperation. Mara knew instinctively that any sudden movement could provoke them. She froze, every nerve screaming, every instinct urging flight, but her body refused to comply fully. Hours blurred. The forest bent reality around them. The figures shifted, appearing closer than they should have been, then vanishing, leaving only distorted shadows. Every step forward was a challenge, every glance backward filled with dread. The trio realized they had been walking in circles, returning to the same clearing despite their best efforts. The forest was a maze, adaptive and malevolent, its corridors shifting to contain and confuse. Finally, Mara spotted a faint glimmer between trees, a stream reflecting moonlight. She urged her friends toward it, the possibility of a natural landmark igniting hope. They approached cautiously, the whispering fading slightly but not entirely. Each step along the water's edge was tense, the ground slippery with moss and wet leaves. Shadows lingered, following at a distance, their presence constant but not immediate. Hours later, they found a small ridge overlooking a valley. Light from distant townhouses suggested civilization. Exhaustion overwhelmed fear, but Mara's mind remained alert. The forest had allowed them passage, but she knew it was deliberate, controlled. The escape was a decision, not coincidence. They descended carefully, every movement deliberate, aware that the forest's agents watched their every step, always ready to intervene. By dawn, they emerged fully onto a maintained hiking trail. Birds sang, wind rustled leaves, the forest seemingly benign once again. The whispers were gone, shadows vanished, and the night's terror felt distant. Yet each of them carried the imprint of the forest, the sensation of being observed, the deep understanding that curiosity had come with a price. Mara glanced back at the dark tree line, feeling the weight of its silent judgment. They had survived, but only barely, and the memory of its sentience would never leave them. The forest had grown darker, shadows stretching unnaturally as Mara, Leo, and Sam pressed onward. Every tree seemed to lean closer, branches intertwining above them like the fingers of a giant hand. The fog clung to the underbrush, curling around roots and rocks, making the trail almost impossible to follow. The night air was cold, biting through their jackets, and the silence pressed heavily, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant snapping of a branch. Mara noticed shapes moving at the edges of her vision, slender, elongated forms that vanished when she tried to focus directly. Her heart pounded, every instinct screaming danger. Leo moved ahead, flashlight cutting through the fog, eyes constantly scanning for threats. Sam lagged behind, voice trembling as he muttered about unseen watchers. Mara gripped her backpack straps tightly, forcing herself to keep moving despite the growing terror. The trail twisted sharply, leading them to a small ravine. A narrow wooden bridge, old and rotting, spanned the gap. Mara hesitated, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The shadows seemed to pulse in the corner of her vision, watching, studying. Leo signaled for them to cross cautiously. Step by step, they moved across, every plank groaning under their weight. Halfway across, Mara thought she saw one of the figures beneath the bridge. its reflection shimmering unnaturally in the faint moonlight. Once across, they pressed forward, finding a small clearing with a circle of stones. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and a strange smell, like damp earth mixed with decay, hung heavy. Carvings, similar to the ones they had seen before, etched the stones in jagged loops, pulsing faintly. Mara felt her pulse quicken. This place was alive, the forest's presence more concentrated, as if this circle was the heart of its consciousness. The whispers began again, insidious and omnipresent, urging them to leave, warning them, threatening them. Sam stumbled over a root, almost falling, and the whispers escalated, overlapping in a chaotic rhythm. Shadows moved at the periphery, creeping closer, not attacking yet, but observing, assessing. Mara felt a cold brush against her arm, no visible form, just the sensation, leaving goosebumps in its wake. Every nerve in her body screamed that the forest was a predator, and they were its prey. They tried to navigate away, but the forest refused to let them go. Paths twisted back on themselves, landmarks disappeared, and even the direction of the moon seemed unreliable. The forest had rewritten itself around them, creating a maze designed to confuse and terrify. Mara realized that they could not rely on normal logic. They needed intuition, instincts heightened by fear and urgency. Every shadow could hide a figure, every sound could be a threat, every step a potential trap. The trio moved cautiously, keeping close together. The fog thickened, wrapping around them, muffling sound, dulling their senses. Their flashlight beams barely penetrated the mist, revealing glimpses of twisted roots and branches. Occasionally, they would glimpse movement, slender shapes gliding silently between trees, observing. Mara's stomach churned with dread, yet she forced herself to focus. Panic would get them killed here. Awareness was their only chance. Hours passed, though it was impossible to measure time in the forest's distorted reality. Mara felt exhaustion in every limb, yet stopping seemed even more dangerous. The forest pressed in, a suffocating presence, almost tactile, sensing hesitation. Shadows danced on the edge of perception, teasing, never fully appearing, but always threatening. The whispers spoke now in fragmented sentences, half-words, sounds that embedded themselves in their minds. Leave a don't watching, never leave each fragment a needle of fear. Eventually, they stumbled upon a creek, water glistening faintly in the moonlight. The sound of flowing water brought a momentary reprieve, grounding them, reminding them that something natural existed beyond the forest's manipulation. They followed the creek cautiously, hoping it would lead to safety. Every step was deliberate, the slightest noise could draw attention. Shadows followed silently, never touching, yet their presence was undeniable. Suddenly, the ground beneath Sam shifted slightly, and he tripped over an unseen depression. Mara and Leo grabbed him, pulling him upright. The creek bank gave way to a rocky incline, forcing them to climb carefully. Each movement was taxing, adrenaline and fear driving them upward. From the fog, faint shapes appeared, tall, thin figures with reflective black eyes, gliding silently along the trees. Mara froze, instinctively lowering her flashlight, trying not to attract attention. The figures paused, observing, then vanished. Finally, they emerged onto a small ridge. Moonlight revealed rolling hills and distant signs of civilization. A road, faint lights from houses in the valley. Relief surged, but Mara's mind remained alert. They had survived the forest's immediate threat, but its imprint lingered. The whispering voices, the shadows, the oppressive consciousness, it had tested them, studied them, allowed them to escape, but left a permanent mark. Fear had become memory, and memory would not fade. Descending carefully, they followed the faint light towards safety, never looking back. Every crackle, every rustle of leaves still held the potential for the forest's attention. Mara realized they had been in a place beyond ordinary reality, a sentient environment with its own rules, its own predators, a hidden world lurking within the familiar. They had survived, but the forest's judgment remained, waiting, patient, inevitable. Hours later, they reached a maintained trail, stepping into normalcy. Birds sang, the wind carried the scent of pine, and the night seemed ordinary. Yet each of them felt the lingering fear, the knowledge that the forest had seen them, understood them, and would not forget. Mara glanced over her shoulder, knowing the shadows would remain, watching, always ready for the next intruders. The forest grew eerily quiet as Mara, Leo, and Sam continued along the winding path. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the ground uneven and littered with jagged roots and fallen branches. Mist clung to the forest floor, curling around their legs, obscuring the trail ahead. Mara felt a chill that wasn't just from the night air, it was deeper, as though the forest itself pressed against her, aware of every heartbeat, every shiver, every thought. Leo moved ahead cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog. Sam lagged, muttering nervously about shapes moving in the shadows. Mara gripped her backpack straps tightly, forcing herself to focus, though every instinct screamed danger. The whispering had returned, soft and persistent, circling their minds. The words were fragmented. Observe, leave, belong, never escape. Each fragment carried a weight, embedding fear that wasn't entirely rational but wholly unavoidable. They came upon a hollowed grove, trees intertwined at impossible angles, their bark twisted into intricate patterns that seemed alive. Shadows lurked between the trunks, shifting subtly, always just out of clear view. Mara could feel them observing, waiting, testing. She urged her friends to move carefully, understanding that one wrong step could trigger the forest's attention, a response they could not predict. A faint glimmer appeared ahead, faint moonlight reflecting off a small stream. Relief surged through Mara, though caution remained paramount. Every rustle, every movement of the mist hinted at potential threats. As they approached, Mara saw figures emerging at the edges of the clearing, tall, thin, with limbs bent unnaturally. Their faces were obscured, but their reflective eyes glimmered faintly in the moonlight. They moved fluidly, silently, almost like liquid shadows, observing, cataloging, understanding. Mara froze, heart pounding, as a subtle pressure pressed into her mind. Images, sensations, and emotions passed between her and the figures: fear, curiosity, desperation. The forest was alive, aware, sentient, and these beings were its enforcers, agents maintaining its dominance. She realized that every instinct, every fear was being analyzed, each of their movements weighed, judged. Sam whimpered beside her, eyes wide, frozen in terror. Leo clenched his fists, scanning for any possible escape, though logic seemed futile in this distorted reality. Hours passed, though time itself felt suspended. The forest's geometry shifted continuously, paths looping back unexpectedly, distances stretching and contracting. Mara understood that they were being guided, herding subtly, and that escape was contingent on obeying the forest's unspoken rules. Shadows flitted at the periphery, never attacking directly, but their presence was oppressive, a constant reminder of the intelligence behind the wilderness. They followed the stream carefully, stepping over roots and rocks hidden beneath layers of leaves. The figures flitted between the trees, always tracking, never touching. Mara felt the forest bending reality around them, forcing awareness, sharpening instincts, and deepening fear. Every sound was amplified, every shadow distorted. They could no longer rely on ordinary perception. Survival demanded heightened attention and careful action. Finally, a small ridge appeared, revealing distant lights from a valley below. Civilization, faint but undeniable. Relief surged, but Mara remained vigilant. The forest had allowed them passage, deliberate and controlled. Shadows receded, whispers softened, yet the sense of being watched persisted. Mara understood that the forest's consciousness lingered even when its direct agents were absent. They descended carefully, guided by intuition and the faint glow below. Every rustle, every flicker of movement reminded them of the trials they had endured. The forest had tested them, learned them, and allowed survival only when it deemed it appropriate. Mara reflected on the experience. The terror, the manipulation of reality, the ever-present awareness. It was unlike anything documented in the world outside, a hidden dimension intertwined with the familiar, yet beyond comprehension. As they reached a maintained trail, normalcy returned. Birds sang, wind rustled leaves, and the night seemed ordinary. Yet each of them felt the lingering presence of the forest, an indelible mark on their consciousness. They had survived, but the memory of its intelligence, its awareness, and its agents would haunt them indefinitely. Every shadow, every whisper, every faint movement in their peripheral vision became a reminder that the forest had not forgotten, and it never would. By dawn, they had reached the road leading back to the town. Exhausted, shaken, and forever changed, they looked back once more at the dark tree line. The forest loomed silently, patient and eternal, a presence that observed and waited. Mara understood the truth. Survival was not just about escaping the forest. It was about enduring the memory, carrying the lesson, and never allowing curiosity to lure them back into its grasp. The forest did not forgive, and it never forgot.